Have you ever needed a supportive community in your journey to advance racial equity, stop and prevent oppression, and catalyze change in your life or your organization? Join us in our online community at intentionallyact.com. As James Baldwin wrote, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced." Join us online to confront the challenging questions and situations in your journey to advance racial equity as we build community to offer professional, personal, and organizational development, skills, and knowledge.
Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Arya Martin. Welcome to Intentionally Act Now, a podcast that supports the All Aces mission to activate consciousness, catalyze critical thinking, and transform capabilities that advance racial equity and build resilience within ourselves and our organizations. We feature a wide variety of leading experts in diversity, equity, and inclusion, conflict management, critical race theory, personal growth, and more.
Hi, this is your host, Enrico E. Manalo. In this episode of Intentionally Act Live, formerly All Aces on Air, Dr. Vibhuti Aryia Amirfar, Associate Clinical Professor at St. John's and Clinical Advisor to the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, sits down with me to talk about dark room methodology, a framework that she uses to bring light to structural racism, as well as what it means to step into your lens. Our conversation also moves through the critical inner voice, our relationships with ourselves, virtue signaling, wokeness, and the role of authenticity in productively doing something about racism. Share your questions and reflections about this episode of Intentionally Act Live in our online learning community at intentionallyact.com. I am here with Dr. Arya Amirfar, who is based in New York. Dr. Arya is a speaker, educator, trainer, and leader who also holds a PharmD and MPH. In her work in creating brave spaces, not safe spaces, for people and systems to intentionally work toward dismantling systemic racism, Dr. Arya draws on her experiences in theater as a yoga teacher, her experiences as an immigrant, and a generic brown woman. She's perhaps best known for her darkroom methodology, which shares much of the same DNA as the DARE model developed by the founder of All Aces Inc., Dr. Arya Martin, CEM. If darkroom methodology sounds familiar, you may have seen her on TEDx Rutgers, where she delivered her talk, Darkroom Methodology, bringing light to structural racism. As working on the self is so deeply important to the work of Dr. Arya and All Aces, we'll be talking about how we develop our lenses as humans who are engaged in diversity, equity, and inclusion work, anti-racism, and advancing racial equity, with an eye toward stepping into ourselves. Even if you're not in that line of work, stay tuned. Stepping into ourselves is another way of saying becoming whole. So great to be here with you finally. How are you today?
Thank you. I'm doing well, taking it day by day. So hope you're well too.
Yeah, I'm doing well. I'm kind of enjoying I think I'm enjoying moving towards Thanksgiving, even though it's going to be a little bit of a strange Thanksgiving, I think. Nonetheless, it is kind of comforting to know that we're moving closer to the holidays. I don't know how things are for your family at the moment, but.
Yeah, well, we just celebrated Diwali, and it's our Hindu New Year. I just think that all of the holidays and all the time right now is going to be indicative of sort of some of the soul searching, the moments of reflection, and taking a step back to just accept and appreciate whatever we can cherish at this time, right? And
Mm-hmm.
Just kind of move with it as best as we can.
Definitely. So my standard first question for you is, what made you fall in love with what you do?
Great question. I think that for me, coming from, being a first generation immigrant, coming from sort of that lens of being in a community that I grew up in Washington Heights, I had just a lot of community feel, whatever that means to people. I know to some it means, the sounds they hear, the food they eat, the people they see on the streets. And for me, it was a combination of all of that and just kind of understanding things from a very grassroots, social justice sort of beginnings. And then I also, borrowing from, as I grew up in India, just kind of having so much sociopolitical
Mm.
change and movement in the 80s, and then coming here. And I think just realizing the human spirit, what it's capable of and what it can do, that has just, moved mountains. And I don't mean to sound like a cliche, but just kind of really understanding how deep we all are and can be, and merging the social justice component in the community and grassroots with being a healthcare professional, and just kind of bringing the arts and mindfulness as a yoga teacher. All of that sort of amalgamates to, for me, resonates very much so with the central principle of raising the collective consciousness in a way. And so coming to the work of structural racism and really looking at things through the lens of equity, really is all about reimagining our future for what we want it to be. That there's an acceptance of these sort of antiquated structures that were built during a time where the lens was not complete, when the understanding was limited and the perspectives were limited, right? That were
Mhm.
not sort of holistic in a way. And so, I think just realizing the totality of so much that was missing from those narratives that could shape the beauty of what we want to create in our future, long after we're dead and gone, right? I used to say I want to be a good ancestor, but I think I have moved that towards this sort of journey of, in my lifetime right now, I want all of this generation that's coming up. I want to get out of their way, and I want them to make our work look cute. I want them to look at these conversations and be like, "Ugh, you guys thought that was cool," just
Oh, you were on the
moving the
cutting edge,
needle.
were you?
Exactly. They're like, this was cutting edge. Like, all right, step away. Yeah. So I think that it's about reimagining. It's about using all of those principles, seeing what's common, understanding the human spirit, and pushing ourselves to evolve and reimagine what we want things to be like.
So that all sounds very daunting. So maybe you can help us connect the dots between, because we've got people watching who are sitting there and saying like, I'm doing everything I can to make myself better, to learn as much as I can so that I can function in the world in a way that doesn't replicate harm. But what does it mean for us to fully step into our lens? Like, how do we do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think something that all of us are battling, frankly, every day, because right now, especially in this moment of time, things just seem completely out of hand, right? Things seem too daunting and just kind of overwhelming to even think about. I think that part of that understanding is just taking a somber moment, like, it took the entire world to be on pause for certain things to come to light in such a visceral and mainstream way. That's not an accident. That's not a coincidence, right? I'm a
Mhm.
believer that the universe acts the way it acts in a very for a reason. And I
And just
think
to be
that
very clear, we're talking about all of the systemic and structural racism that is coming to light, right?
for some of us has come to light many years ago, but or since our very existence. But yeah, I think just the way it's being talked about mainstream. So not that it
Okay.
didn't exist or it wasn't experienced, but I think coming to the surface, right? Like it's like that
Mhm.
boiling of the convection current just coming up a little bit. And I do think that there is it's different. But I think the first thing that we all have to do is sort of take pause and realize that it is daunting, right? To
Yeah.
realize the enormity of it, because I think by minimizing it is not going to get us far. So realizing the enormity of it will give us a chance to understand how to parse out a little bit of, what's in our control, what's not, right? It's like the Covey's sort of circle of concern versus circle of influence is so tiny. And so I remind all of us to kind of, offer that into our psyche and saying that, yes, it's daunting. Yes, there's so much, but there are ways in which I have agency. There are ways in which I have power and that I hold power. And power in different ways. I think we usually hear a lot of like power over things being talked about, but
Right.
power to do things, power in, right? Like there's so many different ways for us to
Power
understand. And I
with.
think power with, that's right. And so I think for us, it's really, really important as individuals, wherever you are, whoever you are, that you can think about ways in which you and your own narrative, right, step into your lens of your own narrative and understanding what is that narrative. What are the parts of the narrative that you get to own and that you get to say out loud first? And what are the parts of the narrative somebody told for you? What
Right.
are the parts of the narrative that seem inaccurate? Or what are the parts of the narrative that frankly seem ugly or that you didn't like, or maybe there are things in there that you don't appreciate, and that we kind of want to turn a blind eye to, right? That was the whole point of the dark room methodology, is kind of a la photography, right? To go in there and when the lights are dark, right, when there's nobody else listening to you, when you don't have social desirability to kind of say the right thing or do the right thing, what do you say out loud? What do you see? What do you know about your story? And what are you willing to accept? And I think for me, I look at the canvas, right? Like your life is like, I'm all about theater, so it's like a musical, or it's like a, if you think about it as art, as canvas, there might be blotches of paint in there that you messed up on, or you didn't like, or didn't come out the same way that you wanted, but that's all part of your canvas, right? And so part
Hmm.
of the stepping into your lens is taking a really honest and sort of raw, unpolished, uncured sort of look at what is your story. And I think it's a lifelong process. It's not something that's going to be quick or um, um, doesn't have sort of closure maybe in the same
Hmm.
way, but that it's just an iterative process that's evolving. And so we just kind of evolve with it and accept our vulnerabilities and understand that, for some of us, maybe it's that, oh my gosh, it took so long to realize racism exists. For some of us, it may be, I've known it existed, but I chose not to do anything. Or for some of us, it may be finding agency, right, and finding power within ourselves in ways that we never found it before, and to commit to action, right? So all of us are at different points of our journey, but I think that whatever we can do to move that journey towards progress is what we're talking about. And stepping into your lens, it's really understanding who you are, embracing it, the good, the bad, the ugly, all of it, almost as if you would embrace a beloved, right? Like with so much more
Hmm.
compassion. So reaching into
Hmm.
that beloved inside of you and embracing that and saying, okay, I accept you for the totality that you are. And that's when you start seeing, practicing towards healing happening.
I just have to say, I've heard about this talked. People have many, many different analogies to talk about what you and I are discussing right now. And of course, this is a bias on my part. I was a professional photographer for a little bit, but what I like about the framing of darkroom methodology is it places the person doing the developing kind of at the center. And we all have our own ways of for example, if my good friend and I are both photographers, we can take pictures of the same subject, but how we develop those images is going to be totally different based on so
Exactly.
many very small factors. And that's going to make the work unique. And that's also what's going to make the work valuable and special. And I think that's really easy for us to forget in racial equity work. And if we can return to Stephen Covey for a second. So Vibhuti was talking about our circle of interest versus our circle of concern. This is something we talk about a lot at All Aces. And just to break that down very quickly for our audience, there is, like, imagine a circle. There's a little circle of things that I can actually have an impact on today, right now, just by myself. But that's not the full scope of everything that I care about. That said, everything I care about, I can't directly do anything about. Like, I'm concerned about the whales, but there's nothing I can do from my little studio apartment to save the whales right here, right now. But linking up with other people who are working on that self-development, we can kind of also link up our direct impact, and in that way, we can actually create great change. So I really see the development of the self as being crucial to changing anything larger than the individual. And it's easy to lose sight of that, I think.
Yeah, and I think part of that is also, I think that perhaps socially too, we're all concerned about being, right, the human spirit wants to belong. We want to belong and be part of something. hopefully bigger than ourselves. But I think part of it is also recognizing our own individual agency in doing that.
Yeah, definitely. So I know that, we got a little bit of, I think we have a visitor. So I think that Vibhuti will be back in a second. Hello, hello. Um, we were talking before the show started a little bit of knowledge can be a dangerous thing, right? So I've definitely experienced this. Like I learned like something that I thought was really cool and really helpful. And then like a couple weeks later, a friend of mine also discovered it. And my reaction, which I'm not proud of, was very much like, ah, that's old news. I already knew about that. Like you got to get on the new stuff, right? So people talk about virtue signaling. And I don't know if that's exactly the right, I think it's slightly different, but how can we, as we are developing ourselves, also be mindful, respectful, supportive of other people who are also trying, but maybe they didn't start out at the same time as us, or maybe they've got a different distance to go. Like who knows what burdens other people are carrying, you know?
Yeah, and I think the best for me, what made it the most clear for that was, I practice and teach Kundalini yoga, and we spend quite a bit of time talking about what we call the spiritual ego, right? And so the idea
Mm-hmm.
here is like, if you've ever, and we've all sort of seen it, but may not have named it that way, but we see sort of people who meditate or yoga teachers kind of, there's such a focus on like being better than others, right? It's like I can hold this posture well, or I can meditate. I've meditated for 10 hours, and it's like you're not better than anybody because you've done that. And the
Right.
idea being that you need to be careful of that, because the spiritual ego will want to separate itself as sort of this high and mighty, right? Like you've discovered the Holy Grail or whatever. And the idea that somehow everybody else is sort of beneath you because they haven't meditated or whatever, right? And the
Mm-hmm.
idea here is that to remember that everybody's on their own journey. And, in yoga, one of the things, the myths that I love to dispel is that, people are like, oh, I've perfected tree pose, right? And
Okay.
it's like, okay, great. Have you perfected tree pose on a full moon? When you have your cycle? Or when you're really hungry, or when you're thirsty, or with the breath of fire, there's always modulations and things that can be thrown in, the variables that exist that actually can tip you over, make things harder a little bit, right? And so the idea is to remember that in a very humble manner, to say and to commit yourself to that humility, right? Which is kind of at the core of this dark methodology that I present, because unless you're humble, your ego is going to want to try to hang on to the comfort of achieving something, right? It's
Yeah.
going to be like, you're done, you're good. This is your
Yeah.
deed for the day.
I can
And the
move on.
idea, right? And the idea being of, you're in it. It's like a marathon, right? Like you can't do the sprint and then be like, I'm done. But the
Right.
idea that your journey with this is going to be so long that you do have to commit to that humility and remember that just because you discovered this one thing and somebody else may not be talking about it, or just starting to discover it, there's a difference between surrounding yourself with energy that pushes you to elevate further, right? So that you're also growing. But there's a difference between judging those and saying, man, you're like, 3 years behind me or whatever. We're already talking about XYZ, right? And that's the part. To bring in the great yogi Dave Chappelle into this conversation, one of
I
the
refer
things
to him as a philosopher personally,
it's
but
good. I think that there's, in one of his stand-up acts, he talks about sort of, supporting they're different people, right? And talking about women and part of the Me Too stuff that happened, but really the idea that there's some people who are going to hold the line different than others, right? And so
yeah.
we need to be able to forgive the ones who are weaker, but also support the ones who are stronger, right? And I love that, because it does remind me of yoga teachings, right? It's like you don't poo-poo anything, you don't dismiss things because of wherever people are, because remember that you yourself also, right, are going to be at all these different points in your journey. And that's why I think it's to remember that it's an iterative process is important, because there are days where you're going to be like, I got this. I just facilitated this amazing session, and then there are going to be other days where you're like, that could have gone better. right? And
Yeah.
to allow yourself the grace, but also allow yourself the understanding that you stand up for who you are and for the right thing. You don't apologize for the message, perhaps the manner, okay, but you don't apologize for doing the right thing, because um, rarely ever people who do the right thing and stand up for the right thing are celebrated for it, right? Until
Yeah.
probably end of
Absolutely.
their career or when they're dead. So, you
If then.
know, exactly. And part of that is recognizing that that will be the case. And I think that's okay. And I think the people who it matters to the most are gonna just know it. And to keep that focus, right? Like I don't there are days where this morning was one of them where I was just kind of like, I want to hang on to the face of humanity, but sometimes for some reason, thinking that people are going to choose not to do the right thing or to be complacent or not to speak up, even when they have all the power to speak up, thinking about that gets me down, because maybe part of me thinks like that's going to be the norm. I don't know, right? Like there are days when I can fight that, and there are days when I'm just like, yeah, it's all good. But it's it's a cyclical sort of process, and you just have to, the same grace and compassion I would have for, again, a beloved or a friend or family member, you need to allow that for yourself too, because that's what it is to step into your own lens. It's to own who you are, and it's to speak my story, right, without feeling like I have to fit into somebody else's version of my story. That you get to own that story, and you get to, however it is, whatever it is, it's your reflection of your experience, and not to be afraid to say that out loud, perhaps.
So, I mean, one thing that's really helped me in engaging with this work in this way is that I do have a background in the arts. And so if you're out there kind of relating, like if you remember back to your first drawing classes or writing classes, it's all very inward and very personal, and trying to get to know yourself. For somebody who hasn't had that privilege, and let's be real, like that is an enormous privilege that I have. How, like wherever they are right now, how do they start? Maybe I keep coming up with excuses. I might psych myself out of actually doing it, just in thinking, building myself up to try it, But how is it that, because it sounds like a really important piece to what we're talking about is that humility piece. So is there something that somebody could do today to just kind of be like, okay, if I can't do anything else, I can be humble?
Yeah, and I'm not, uh, I always look at it as a commitment. Um, I'm not sure if it's as easy as maybe we make it sound to be, right? Because there's a lot of things you're battling. And one of
Hmm.
the things you're battling is your own narrative about yourself, right? We
Uh-huh.
all we all have narratives with which we shape every single thing we do. So it's relationships, it's who we, so going back to your photography thing, right? About you can choose to develop a very different picture than your friend, even though you took the same shot, so to speak, or you
Yeah.
photographed the same scene. And part of that is your process, and part of that is allowing yourself permission to mess up in that process. And I think that's a big one, right? Because socially, I think people talk about, every time I get on these panels about like women and STEM and kind of leadership and da da da. It's all like lead by example. I want to be a woman, and I'm always like fail by example, right? And and the reason I say that is because I think that it's we're all gonna mess up. I don't know what world that we're, I can't fathom having so much pressure, and we all have felt it to a certain extent, right? About being perfect, or doing the right thing all the time, or not messing up for some reason. I'm not sure how we've set this up, but I think that's what you're talking about with that psyching yourself out of, like,
Yeah.
if I've had so many people in my coaching, in these conversations, to come be like, well, I don't want to say this because I don't want to say the wrong thing. And
Yeah.
so it prevents them from having the conversation altogether,
It
right?
really does.
Which is so problematic, because I'm like, well, you can sort of always keep wondering what it would be like to say what you need to say, or you can actually say it, and it's okay to mess up and ruffle some feathers, and maybe learn about a different process of yours saying things the way you would. But it not to just crush the conversation, not to not have, because I think that we're like all subscribed, right? Hit subscribe to this like perfect way or politically correct or whatever correct way of saying things, that we don't even engage. And I think
Right.
that's an issue. And I think where the humility comes in is just even allowing yourself the vocabulary to say, hey, um, I am not probably going to say the right thing. And I'm going to apologize, not to absolve myself of any impact that my words have, but just to set you up to say, like, I'm going to probably be an idiot in the conversation or going to get there. But I'm willing to embrace my vulnerability and say, I would really like to learn something, or I would really like to move myself further in the conversation. So I think even allowing yourself to embrace that vulnerability is so important. And I think by doing sort of repeated hits of that, it gives yourself permission a little bit, right? And it gives yourself, you feel in your body, instead of this all the time, maybe the next time it'll be this, maybe after that it'll be this, maybe after that it'll be this. And then maybe the time after that, you'll even be excited to engage and to mess up and see how you can get back up again, right? It's like kids on a monkey bar, right? Like when they're on monkey bars, they're not like, I am gonna be perfect. You know, they're just like, right? They fall, they mess up, whatever they do, they just kind of embrace it. And I think that we all could use a little bit of a lesson to be in that moment and embrace some of that vulnerability, not be so hung up on doing the right thing or whatever that means to us, whatever narrative we have, to just kind of check that.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, I think the amazing thing about monkey bars that I remember from like my nephews and nieces is I'd see them fall and then I'd see them immediately run back around to the other side to do it again, you know?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
somewhere along the way between then and who we are as adults, there's something that creeps in where it's just like,
Well, we get
no,
conditioned to the norms, right? We get
yeah.
conditioned to these norms. I put them in air quotes because it's stuff people have created around us. And
Hmm.
so I think you know, the way I kind of look at it is like, how do we challenge those norms? How do we challenge the status quo? How do we, but if we don't allow ourselves the permission to mess up, we can't, you know. Okay, Lily. um okay. Sorry.
No
But
problem.
I think that's that's the, you know, speaking of kid like lovingness, I think that's part of the thing we have to commit to is allowing children to disrupt in a way that they do, allowing because it challenges us to decondition ourselves of those norms too, right? And I think that's really important because again, we're trying to reimagine what we want. It's not just by sticking to the existing structures that we're gonna get things right. We're just not, right? And so how do we, if we don't push ourselves to reimagine, if we don't push ourselves to challenge the status quo, we're also then basically suppressing voices of those who we need, the innovators, the people who are like, hey, we could do things a little bit differently. And I think that's really important.
Definitely. Looks like we've got a comment here. Yes, so Vince mentions embracing our vulnerability. That's inspiring. I mean, to that end, when we're talking about embracing vulnerability, and you were talking before about that inner narrative as well. I've noticed that because I do have that background in the arts, for a large portion of my life, that inner voice was very, very critical, in fact, hypercritical of the things that I produce, right? So it was to the point where I actually could not enjoy my own work at all. So as we're engaging in these processes, right, if we're being vulnerable, that's outward facing, but then we have to be vulnerable to ourselves as well. And I think that can be the scarier thing. So I wonder, like, in developing the self and stepping into our own lens, have you found any ways that we can attend to that?
Yeah. So a long time ago, the critic, by the way, continues to get worse too, right? Like it's not going to stop because
Yeah, more
part
skilled,
of
yeah.
part of the journey to growing is also to do some self-criticism. But you have to, I think there's a way to be healthier, more forgiving, and you know, the words grace and compassion come to mind. So
Mm-hmm.
for myself in my own journey, the way that I embraced that was long before I was married and had kids. I used to think, if I were my own daughter, what would I say to myself? For some reason, the maternal thing worked for me. That's why I say the beloved, right? Whatever beloved
Mm.
means to you, because we all have some relationship we hold, or some romantic idea of a relationship we hold dear to our hearts, whether it's a parent, a family, loved one, whatever. And if we can think about ourselves or like inner selves as that, when I said that to myself, it changed the way that my critic showed up for me, right? My inner critic. Because I was like, okay, if my daughter came to me with all the stuff I'm coming to myself with, I would never be as harsh. I would say, here's a bowl of ice cream, fresh blueberries on top. Let's sit and cry and just like, we'll be fine. Let's talk about it, right? Like, let's feel the emotions, and just holding that safe container, holding that container of space, and frankly, grace and compassion, right? Like, you fell, you're going to get back up again, or whatever the case was, right? And so I think that part of it is, um, think about a relationship that you would want to hold dear to your heart, and just start treating yourself that way, right? Like, because I think that if you can figure out that compassion and that, again, humility and the patience that it takes to do that, you probably are going to be a better partner. I feel like I am a better mother because I asked myself that question. I'm a better educator because of these questions I asked myself, and the grace and compassion with which I see my students or my colleagues. And I think that it's also okay for me to remember that I can call things out too that are not okay, or that are hurtful to me, or to the process of whatever I'm facilitating. So it's an evolving journey, but embracing that vulnerability is not just an external thing, because externally things will soothe your ego for that. Right now,
Mm.
vulnerability is super sexy, right? Like, if you are all about embracing vulnerability outwardly, oh, there are going to be lots of things and people and words and sayings and books that are going to feed your ego. The true test is embracing it inside and being able to say, okay, what is my relationship to that narrative? How do I start defining things? Byron Katie does a lot of this positive psychology work, and there's this
Mm-hmm.
thing called the work. And
Yeah.
and part of her narrative, right, and kind of coaching people through it is, like, you write down a sentence, right? Like, I just said X, and now Rico's gonna think ill of me. And so it's
Right.
like, okay, do you know that to be true? And you're like, yes. And then you're like, do you know that to be to 100%? And of course, the answer is usually no, right? Because
Right.
I'm all up in your head right now. I'm anticipating, right, what you're doing,
Oh
right?
no.
Right. And then it's like, okay, so when I believe that sentence, when I believe that narrative, what happens to me? Oh, I start like overextending, I start overcompensating, I start apologizing, I start doing all these things that are basically not authentic, right? To our
Right.
to our
Yeah.
conversation. And so, and then, a part of that work is then, okay, so now you flip it, right? What if the reverse? Okay, well, Rico embraces whatever I say, or blah, blah, blah. Okay, now how does that make you feel, right? Like, how does adopting that other narrative? And it's like, yeah, like, I feel liberated. I don't have this burden on me, right? So all of these things, I'm kind of reinforcing this idea about, the narrative and the inner critic, and the inner monologues we have going on about every single thing, just to kind of check it, right? Check your assumptions. And in this work for racism, right, we talk about this, right? What are the intention can be good, but the impact not so much. And, question the assumptions, right? If I say, we need XYZ at our place of work, what are the assumptions there, right? What are the
Yes.
assumptions about, when people say things like, well, I don't mind hiring a person of color, but I want to make sure they're qualified. I'm like, what are the assumptions there, right? What are what are the things that you're saying out loud that are unspoken, right? But that kind of come across for those of us who can see it through that statement. So I think that part of that humility is also recognizing that we are going to mess up along the way. And again, this vulnerability thing is not necessarily, it's not necessarily to say, I think a lot of people associate it with weakness, or they think that,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
it's sensitivity or whatever. And I'm like, actually, understanding who you are and what makes you tick is a strength of yours, right? Understanding how to, I cannot understand how to navigate emotion without actually acknowledging and feeling those emotions, right?
That's
So
true.
that's what you have to do is recognize, okay, if somebody asks me question X, I know I'm going to get all, whatever about it. So in theater, a lot of people who do theater or do, any sort of performing arts, um, our introvert part of us actually comes
Sure.
out more because we get to be almost in a dark room. Like, I know there's lights and whatever, but these like blue light performances, right, where you can't really see people in the audience and the lights are
Yeah.
on top. You have the creative expression, you just step into it. And I remember when I first started doing theater and just sort of doing like stage acting, I remember I would think you had to be who you thought the audience wanted you to be. Does that make sense? Right? It was like
It
an
does. Yeah.
expectation of your role. And then I was like, well, how do I bring thee into everything I want to be? And I remember sort of that narrative about like taking that nervousness or that energy and kind of channeling it into the performance. And I just got to be whoever I wanted to be on stage, right? And
Yes.
it's again, when you embrace it, you bring a totality to that performance that you can't bring if you're not fully realizing it, right? And I think part of that like vulnerability and that inner critic and all of the things we're talking about is also, for me, recognizing like I'm a very fiery person, right? I
Same.
have a lot of fire. And what that's it doesn't stop there because different people experience what being fiery means in different ways.
Yeah.
And fire can consume you, it can burn you
Hmm.
out, but it's also used for alchemy and transformation, right?
Hmm.
So for me, my narrative is always like, okay, how do I take this and move it towards that? How do I take this and move it towards that? Am I moving it, right? And
Hmm.
that's where my sort of like for being on stage, that's what I, right? Like, where do I take that fire and move it to this transformative character? How do I create physical physicality around me on a stage, as a, so I think part of it is just it's taking that embracing vulnerability to a almost a different height, right? Because it's going to mean different things for different people. So for some of us it may just mean that, okay, I just have to realize that I have to give myself permission to fail, and
Right.
it just
Yeah.
starts there. For some of us it's like, well, I'm not afraid of saying that thing, I'm afraid of what somebody else will say back, right? So then that's the journey. And for some of us it's just, I just get really worked up and I need to figure out how to be more compassionate to others, for example, or whatever that case may be. So I think that there's a lot of things to work with. Ultimately comes back to the stepping into your lens of like, I'm the only person qualified to step into my own lens.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what I was thinking when you were talking about the fire metaphor is if I'm going to come in and tend to somebody else's fire, then I also run the risk of burning down their house, you know? So that makes a lot of sense. One thing I was also thinking about, and I wonder if you don't want to go in this direction, that's totally fine. I've run into a couple people, both personally and professionally, who have come right up to me and kind of said something along the lines of, "Oh yeah, I see what you do. I'm really woke, so I think we can get along." And it's like, oh, okay. So when that person said woke, that does not talk about, like, that does not speak to the inner work that you and I are trying to get at. Because to me, that seems very externally facing, like, hey, everybody, I'm doing the right things and you should too. And that's like, I don't know about that.
Yeah, and maybe
I
that goes back
don't
to
know
your
about that.
virtue signaling, right? Like that kind of
Yeah,
goes back to that. It's like, okay, so what are you actually going to do about things, right? And
right.
so I think that for those of us who do this work, and as we know, it carries a lot of emotional labor. It also carries a lot of backlash at times, right? For standing up and doing the right thing or saying things a certain way or whatever. And I think that it's a little bit of a two-pronged question, right?
Yeah.
So one is you show up professionally to do that. So in a professional, if you've hired me to do that and somebody's saying that, there's a way that I would go about facilitating that conversation and saying, okay, well, tell me more about this. I'm excited to hear about your journey, right? Like professionally, you can deal with that a certain way. And then personally, it's a little bit different because you're like, dude, I'm just trying to recover, right? Like I
Right.
need some time. So the way that I think about that is, and perhaps this might help with that stepping into the lens too, is um, you think about if you were performing somewhere, right? It goes back to theater
Mhm.
again. And different sets, right, require different costume changes, right? So you go
Mm-hmm.
backstage, you do your thing, you are used to changing depending on the set you have to walk into, depending on your environment.
Mm-hmm.
But when your performance is done, you get to go home and just kind of
Right.
be who you are, right? And for a lot of us, it's hard to know who we are after all that musical is done, after that performance is done. Because I've been changing for so long, depending on every single set I'm in, that I no longer remember who that is underneath all of that, right? That perhaps different set of sort of survival mechanisms or being a social chameleon or just kind of moving into things require different things of you. And so part of stepping into that lens and kind of being woke on the inside, so to speak, is again having a very honest conversation with yourself about what that means. So some of the things, frankly, people will ask me. So they'll say, "Hey, I thought about, like I said," and I'm like, "Tell me why you said what you said." And these are friends, so I can ask them this, right? I'm like, "Tell
Okay.
me
Yeah.
what you were hoping to get out of that, right? Like, what does that mean?" And like, yeah, I guess I was trying to convey how cool I am because I'm really uncomfortable about talking about racism as a white person. And I'm like, okay, now we can dig in. Now we have something, right? Like that's authentic. So
Yeah.
let's dig more into that, right? And so sometimes even asking a question and it is difficult. It is difficult, maybe not difficult, it's challenging. And so when somebody throws that at you, right? So Rico has to ask the question, it's like, okay. Because I think for me too, similar to what you said, somebody says I immediately am like, we're good. Thank you very much. Like if we were actually connecting, you wouldn't have had to say that. You know what I mean?
Right.
But at the same time, again, I'm like, okay, let me think about it with compassion. Like, what is, because that person may be embracing vulnerability, saying that. Maybe that person is like saying, hey, I kind of want to be woke. I don't know what that means. So I'm trying it on the surface level. And again, professionally, I can dig that. Personally, I'm like, I don't, right now, I'm too, like, I need to self preserve and I don't have space to do that work with you right now. Like, you need to do some
Yeah.
work. Right. And,
Definitely.
yeah, and I think it'll show up differently in different ways, but it also, part of that vulnerability is also being able to say, like, I'm really glad. I would love to chat with you more about that. I just, right now, I'm in a space where I need to do some processing on my own. And so
Mm-hmm.
would love to connect another time, and usually I feel like if and when you do end up connecting later, it's at a deeper level than that
Yeah.
initial conversation, perhaps.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's definitely something to that. Um, so much of the social space is like, well, if I don't get this right, then I will never have this opportunity again. And that's just kind of not really true at all. But we let ourselves think that very easily. Um, I think Vibhuti will be back with us in a moment, but for now, I think let's pivot to a comment that we got from Mona Roy. So, Miles, if we could bring that up on the screen, please. Mona says, I think that our strengths and perceived weaknesses are often two sides of the same coin. I am constantly working on embracing and supporting my own identity. It is a longer journey. Uh, Dr. Amirfar's blue light parallel sounds like a great tool for the toolkit in doing this equity work. Your response?
Yeah, I agree with I hear that 100% about the strength and perceived weakness. I also think that again, the perception is one thing of what other people may notice or decide for you what that means or doesn't mean. I think
Mm-hmm.
for me, it's about what's my relationship to that. Do
Interesting.
I, right? So it's not just about how people perceive it, but at the end of the day, for me, the first step is what am I thinking about it?
Mm,
So the the very thing that Rico may think, oh, the beauty is totally dope with this aspect. Like, I love that she is fiery and da da da. That same quality to somebody else may be like, no, she is too fiery, she's too vocal. This, like, talking about dropping racism in conversation is too radical, right? Like, the
mm,
very thing somebody loves about you, and I think that's what Mona's also getting at, the strength and the perceived are the same thing sometimes.
Yeah.
And that's okay. And I
Mm-hmm.
think it goes back into being that sort of social chameleon, right? Like there's some times when you pull that out in certain ways and sometimes when you don't, because you know that it's going to be met with whatever resistance. Now, if you see something happening, however, and and this is what I mean about like stepping into your lens and making it's a decision. It's a
Yeah.
decision for you to say, I am, and I don't want to say just like I am going to be authentic, because that, again, becomes very subjective to people or just like too much in the head about things. It's a decision for you to say, I heard somebody say something in front of me to a friend or a colleague or even a stranger. It's not okay.
Mm-hmm.
Do I make that decision to say, hey, that probably was not okay to say? Or do I make a decision not to say that because of my own vulnerability and whatever narrative I have about risking something, right? And
Yeah.
there's some settings where I will say, where I think I have more compassion to that than other settings, because sometimes I'm like, really, what you're deciding to risk is something that somebody else risks all the time, whether they choose to or not. So your decision to step into that lens and say, I choose to speak up even when I feel vulnerable about it is going to be a decision. That's what it is, right? It's a
Mm-hmm.
decision. And
Yeah.
so the blue light thing, as Mo mentioned, might be a good tool is, again, blue light, dark room, but it's basically doing something when nobody else can hear you or see you, right?
Mm-hmm.
When you're alone with your thoughts, what do you say, right?
Right.
When nobody else can say, hey, good job for saying that. When nobody else can say, hey, horrible for saying that. So, right, you can take it either way, but at the end of the day, it's like, what am I about? When I go to sleep, right, it's like what we hear of people saying, well, at least I can go to bed at night properly, right? So
Right.
for me, that marker of success is, if my um, daughter, right, like I have a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old, and both of them, if they ask me, like, hey, how did you handle the situation? They'll call me out, and if I don't practice what I preach, I feel like that's my decision, right? And for
Mm.
me, I want to be able to say when I make decisions to be uncomfortable and to call things out, it's that I want to be able to say, hey, when mama faced this situation, this is what I said. And it may not have been popular at the time, and it may not have, it probably was lonely and unpopular. But that's what leadership is about sometimes, and that's what stepping into your lens is about, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's about owning my own narrative,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that struggle about the strength and perceived weakness being the same thing are real. Ask yourself how you feel about it. Ask yourself how you step into that lens, in that narrative. And again, give yourself some grace and compassion, because you will probably mess up, and not all of us are going to feel super bold, red lipstick every day, but sometimes you may, and sometimes you may not.
So to reflect and collect back some of the things that I'm hearing, actually, if you are fully and humbly stepping into your lens, this is not something that will simplify your life. In fact, it doesn't necessarily simplify anything. But something that's really been on my mind a lot is it's really easy for me to want simple solutions to complex problems. But simple solutions to complex problems will never work. So how do we deal with this complexity? Because it takes a lot of energy, right? If I have to be
Yeah.
responsible for all my choices every day, like how am I going to make it through to the end of the day? You know?
Yeah, and I think that it goes back to what you define as simple, right?
Mm,
Um,
yeah.
because being who you are is simple,
Mm,
right? But it's laborious because we have norms that we respond to all the time. And sometimes being yourself and saying what you truly feel kind of goes against those norms, right? That
sure.
others have developed for you. And I think that that's where the decision making comes in. So there's a great book by Don Miguel Ruiz called The Four Agreements that I
Mhm.
just recommended to a mentee about, and it's simple. It's again simple. It's nothing, it's like be true to your word, don't assume, always do your best, right? It's things that we can do every day. Um, being honest, right? Sounds simple, but when you're dealing with the power dynamic where you have a supervisor who's doing things, or somebody above you in that structure, right, that
Right.
we have constructed, what do you do? And for me, it goes back to that. It goes back to noticing. So picture your first yoga class if you ever have taken one, right? One of the things that we always talk about our students doing is noticing how they're feeling in their bodies, right? You need to understand the sensations in your bodies. So a
Mhm.
lot of people will go to yoga and be like, ugh, this is not the core workout, right? Or like, this is not going to be a workout. It's a bunch of hokey, like meditative or like downward dog, whatever. And then the next morning you wake up and you're like, what are these things I'm feeling in my body, right? There are these muscles that have woken up that are achy and sore that you never knew existed inside of you. So
Yeah.
for me, doing this work is like taking a yoga class. There are going to be things awakening inside of you that you didn't even know you had, or that you've just not paid attention to. And
Hmm.
so, in a similar way that in a yoga class, you are asked to notice how you're feeling. In theater, you are asked to be present with your body and creating a physicality, creating movement on stage, and what that means in terms of the audience moving with you, right? You're setting a scene. And so, in being conscious of all of those things, that's when you make decisions to show up. And in a very similar manner, you're being asked to just pay attention to how you feel, right?
Mm.
Whether when somebody says to you, well, XYZ is not a good comment to make, do you, right? You're going to feel vulnerable, you're going to feel uncomfortable, guaranteed. So do you tense up and you say, I got to go? Or do you lean into that? Or do you lean into that and then you say, how dare you,
Mm.
right? Or do you say, oh crap, can you tell me more? Because I'm not seeing it and I apologize, right? So these are
Yeah.
different choices you can make, and they're exhausting. Yeah, doing the right thing is always, I feel like it's exhausting, but it's also liberating, which is a really weird thing. Um, so I don't think that you can lean in and be so intentional and so deliberate every second of the day because it's going to exhaust you.
Yeah.
The ultimate goal, just like it is in yoga and meditation, is to have it be integrated as part of who you are,
Right.
right? The point of yoga and meditation and sadhana practices where you wake up and you commit to a practice or whatever is not, again, for you to be like, I wake up at 3:30. I've done that, right? You wake up at 3:30 with the
Yeah.
sunrise and you're doing it right. It's the greatest point of on earth. And now with kids, I'm like, my sadhana, my practice is not to lose it, or it's to be patient and to show up with compassion and all of that kind of stuff. And it's challenging, but I think that's what it requires, is that ultimately every moment of a day when I'm walking in a one bedroom apartment with my children, right, that I'm able to tap into that calm, that I'm able to tap into that awareness. And
Hmm.
that's what this work is, right? This work is about leaning into that awareness so that it becomes part of you. Now, is the road to that integration difficult? Yes, right? You become whatever, think of school you went to. You learn how to run Zoom meetings, let's say, or you run how to type a document and go through all the spell check. Every process that you do, the learning of it takes time and practice and patience. And so the idea is that once you start practicing it, however, it becomes second nature. It becomes part of who you are. So now I can talk to you and text from my left hand, right? Just like without even looking, right? So
Yeah.
it's integrating and embracing, and that's why stepping into your lens has to be a core component, because if I don't know who I am and what
Yeah.
narrative I come with and what narrative I want to build, I will not make those decisions accordingly that align and that make me feel like my mind, body, and spirit are aligned. And that's what helps me show up
Hmm.
and embrace that vulnerability, because
Yeah.
otherwise it's foreign, otherwise it's an intellectual exercise and not part of who I am.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it really does strike me that no matter how good we want to be now or in the future, no matter at the end of the day, we're still going to be ourselves, right? And if you don't accept that, then that's a weird, weird space to live in. And millions, hundreds of millions of people are living there right now.
all the time. And
All
sometimes we live in it too. Sometimes we go in and
yeah,
out of it too, right? Where we're like,
yeah,
oh wait, I noticed it, and this is the thing. Like I remember, it's the what I call like the should narrative, right? Like
yeah,
I
yeah.
remember when I first started doing this, like all this meditation, like observe silence, and you're on top of a mountain and meditating, and this is how I used to celebrate my birthday into the woods, and like no phone, nothing. And I remember being like, oh, I should wake up at 3:30 in the morning and do my sadhana. I should whatever. And then I was like, girl, you should be sleeping, right? Like this idea again, because it takes you out of who you are
Yeah,
into who you think you're supposed to be. And that's not a
right.
good narrative to be in, right? Because then every single thing you do, you run the risk of not being, again, stepping into who you truly are. And I think that the lens is so important because and why I chose those words was because when you step into your lens, and similar to what you said, right? The two photographers who can take the same picture but produce very different results. Your lens is your experience, it's your narrative. And
Hmm.
nobody before you or after you or at present is more qualified to do that than you. That's
Yeah,
your lens. And so I don't want to take up space and waste it in this universe, right? If I'm here, I got to figure out like what is my lens with which I view the world? What is the lens with which I see the people in the world? And how do I interpret everything? But that requires again me stepping into my own narrative. And don't get me wrong, I think a lot of times what people struggle with is having your narrative be defined for you.
yeah.
Having your narrative in the shoulds, right? Like you're a
Mhm.
woman, know your role, right? You're not a tenured faculty member yet, you shouldn't speak up, right? Like all of those kinds of structures that I don't know, we all have just found a way to subscribe to, right? It's like the Little Prince, Le Petit Prince, that story, right?
Right, yeah. On
And
his little
it's
planet.
right, and it's like, well, maybe I don't need to do that. Maybe I
So
can figure out how to create a collective that we hold
yeah.
each other accountable through that.
So if I'm getting this right, it sounds like the more that we can get comfortable with our own narrative, like in our own vulnerabilities, and from a very real place, the more able we'll be able to address the narrative that we see driving things in society. So if everybody's telling their own real authentic story, then a more authentic story that that unites us all is kind of happening, and that is something that we could actually enact change within.
Exactly. And so I look at humanity as a big puzzle, right? So we each are
Mhm.
our own unique pieces and we need all of us to complete the puzzle.
Yeah,
But, if I've got like that round thing, right? And then I've got a different groove, right? And
yeah.
I'm constantly trying to fit into something else,
Smash that in
you're
there.
not going
Yeah.
to do it,
No,
right? And so
no.
I think that part of that is embracing who you are, because that's also how I know that I can be more effective in a collective, right? So for me, I'm all about the collective. Like there's a lot of individual work internally, but externally, like I'm all about, okay, how do we create like not just critical mass, but critical connections, right? Like that concept
Absolutely.
of the networks. And so if you can embrace and understand, maybe not even embrace, just accept and understand who you are, and over time embrace perhaps, it also gives
Hmm.
me a very clear picture of what I can do to help. So if I just know that even like in a very practical sense, I'm just not good at this kind of task, then the more real I am with it versus trying to take that same test 1,000 times to prove myself that I'm somehow going to get good at it,
Right.
it's just
Yeah.
not going to work, right? And so if
Definitely.
I can embrace that and being very real with myself, then I know I am more effective in the collective. I am more who I am, but I'm better in supporting others. I am better in giving all of myself to that cause and that movement because that's just who I am. And so
Yeah.
having a very clear picture of that is I think just really liberating from that standpoint.
Absolutely. So we are coming to the end of our time. Unfortunately, I could talk to you all day. Our standard exit question is in 30 seconds or less. It doesn't actually have to be 30 seconds or less, but what would you love to see come out of your work?
More conversations, just inspiring more conversations, and people just going at it, I think is good. Just inspiring more conversations because that's what's going to get us to movement, not being restricted by the expectation or an idea of what I should be, but more just being who I am and adding to that narrative. And the more we can do that, I think we will raise the level of consciousness collectively. And I'm hopeful for that.
Me too. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on today. Thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for watching.
You've been listening to Intentionally Act Live from our website, intentionallyact.com. You can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Submit your stories and questions for future episodes by emailing us at info@allacesinc.com. Until next time.